Welcome to this review of Nervous System Anatomy for Bio 233. My objective with this video is to review the basic structures of the neuron and brain. Your job is to review these structures and learn where they are so that you can earn the best score possible on your lab quizzes and lab practicals. Remember, spelling does count, so you'll want to be certain to review that too. Now, with this video, I'm just reviewing a lot of the basic structures that are likely to show up on your quizzes and practical. If you're responsible for other structures, they will be listed on your lab practical review sheet, so keep that handy while you study. This is a model of neuron anatomy. This model represents a multipolar neuron, and multipolar neurons are the most common type of neuron in the body. Their main function is to communicate information between the components of the central nervous system and those of the peripheral nervous system. You should be able to identify the structures listed on the left side of this slide. The first structure is the cell body, or the soma. It's a rounded structure that's located at one end of the neuron. The cell body houses the nucleus of the cell, which is represented by peach here, and that's where you're going to find the cell's chromosomes and the blueprint for making all of the components that a neuron needs in order to live and function properly. Also within the nucleus, you'll find the nucleolus, which is represented on this model by a purple sphere, but it's really hard to see in this particular image. The nucleolus is where the cell's RNA is produced. You'll also see lots of rough ER and clusters of free ribosomes in the cell body. The clusters of rough ER and free ribosomes are called Nissl bodies, and the Nissl bodies are represented by the blue blobs that you see here in the cytoplasm of this cell body. These are the sites of protein synthesis for the neuron. The fact that there's so many Nissl bodies here in this cell body suggests that this is an area of a lot of protein synthesis, and that the neuron requires lots of protein synthesis in order to survive. The cell body is connected to these projections called dendrites. Dendrites act like ears or antennae, receiving signals from other neurons. And you can see where that happens in this particular model. These gray things that look a little bit like sperm, they're not sperm. These are actually axon termini. So you can see that axon termini are synapsing with the dendrites here, but they can also synapse with the cell body. At the axon terminus, there's usually a release of neurotransmitters, or sometimes there's an action potential, and it excites the cell membrane of this neuron, where we'll get a graded potential. Okay, and remember, graded potentials are a form of communication among neurons. So dendrites act like ears. They synapse with the axon termini from other axons and receive signals. This long tail that's also connected to the cell body is called the axon. And the axon is connected to the cell body by this funnel-shaped region called the axon hillock. The axon hillock is important because this is where action potentials form. And then those action potentials race down the axon towards the axon termini for this particular neuron. The axon termini are actually beyond this image, but they would synapse with effector organs or other neurons. Also associated with the axon are these. These yellow structures are called myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths are formed when special cells called Schwann cells wrap themselves many times around the axon of a neuron, and they insulate it. The outermost layer of the Schwann cell is called the neurolemma, and you can see it here. You'll know the neurolemma when you see it because usually this is where the cytoplasm for the Schwann cell has gotten forced to the outermost layer of the cell, and that's where you're going to find the nucleus. So in this particular model, you can see, I'm going to erase some of these arrows here, but you can see that we have a myelin sheath here, and we have a myelin sheath here as well. So these represent two different Schwann cells. Notice that there's a gap between these cells right here. This is called the node of Ranvier, and it's very important when we consider how signals are transmitted down very long axons. The last thing that's in this figure is this kind of whitish covering that goes on around the outside of the neuron. This is called the endoneurium. Remember how when we were talking about muscle cells, we said that muscle cells have a layer that surrounds them called the endomysium, and then muscle cells get bundled together forming a fascicle, and there's a wrapping that goes around that called the perimysium, and then when you have a whole entire muscle, there's a wrapping that goes around that called the epimysium. It turns out that neurons and nerves have the same kind of arrangement. So since this model represents one neuron, the wrapping that goes around the entire neuron here, or the axon, that's the endoneurium. These neurons get bundled together inside of nerves, and there's a wrapping that goes around those bundles that's called the perineurium. And then your entire nerve has a connective tissue wrapping around it called the epineurium. So the naming convention is kind of the same as what we see with muscle. So let's see if you can identify these structures, but on a different neuron. So this is another model from the lab. Do you see the cell body? This is the cell body. Inside the cell body, remember you have the nucleus. So the nucleus is here. It's this white egg-looking shaped structure. Okay. Inside of the nucleus, you have chromosomes, but you also have the nucleolus. So this clear circle here, this is the nucleolus. Okay. Outside of that, we had Nissl bodies, right? The Nissl bodies in this particular figure are represented in red. So this red net-like material and these little red blobs back here, those are Nissl bodies. Where are the dendrites on this model? Right, that was pretty easy. The dendrites are these kind of branched structures that are sticking out from the cell body. How about the axon? Yes, in this model, the axon is this kind of gray looking plastic line that goes through the bottom of the cell. How about a Schwann cell? The Schwann cells are a little harder to see. I keep changing colors here to try to see if I can find one that's easier for you to see. But the Schwann cell is this cell right here. I don't know if you can see this. That's kind of wrapping itself around the axon. That's your Schwann cell. And remember, this is where your myelin sheath comes from. On this particular model, you can't see the neurolemma, so we won't worry about that here. But do you see a node of Ranvier? Did you say down here? Right. This is your node of Ranvier. On this particular model, you can't see the endoneurium, but you can see axon termini. And they're synapsing with a bit of muscle, it looks like. Do you see them? Right. The axon termini are here at the bottom of this slide. I don't know if you can see this, but I hope you can. So that's your basic structure of a neuron. This is an axon terminus, and you need to be able to identify a few structures here. I hope that you'll recognize this. Oh, wrong color. This is where your axon would be. It would go up in this direction from this terminus. This entire part here is the terminus itself. Okay. The little white spheres that you see here, these are synaptic vesicles. And if we were in the lab, and if you have a really good monitor, you might be able to see the little yellow granules inside. These are the neurotransmitters. The last thing that you need to identify on this model are these guys. These are the mitochondria. We couldn't see them on the other models, but you should know that there are lots of mitochondria inside of your neurons because they need to make a lot of ATP in order to function properly. Now let's talk about the brain. The brain has been called the control center of the human body, and it contains over 1 billion neurons. There are four main parts to the structure of the brain. First, you have the cerebrum. In this image, it's represented by this pale pink structure here. I'm not doing a great job of highlighting it, but hopefully you know that it includes these little bits like this and this that I've missed. The cerebrum consists of two hemispheres, left and right, and they're separated from each other by a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. These hemispheres are connected by a structure called the corpus callosum, which we'll look at on a different slide. And the corpus callosum allows communication to happen between the left and the right hemispheres. The cerebrum is responsible for many of your higher mental functions like interpreting stimuli, directing movement, language production, recognition, associations, memory, all sorts of things. Infero-posterior to the cerebrum is the cerebellum, which is down here. The cerebellum, or little brain, also has left and right hemispheres and functions in refining movements. It helps to maintain our posture so that we can stay balanced. It coordinates and refines our speech and repetitive motor movements. More recently, its role in memory and learning has been revealed, but scientists are still exploring its role in those functions. Anterior to the cerebellum is the pons, which you can kind of see here. The pons is an expansion of the brainstem that relays messages between parts of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. It also plays a role in arousal, respiratory processes, fine motor control, equilibrium, muscle tone, and our circadian cycle. The medulla oblongata, which is down here at the very base of the brain, is an extension of the brainstem that connects the brain to the spinal cord. It also controls various autonomic. Whenever you hear autonomic, you should think automatic or involuntary, meaning you don't have to consciously think of these things. Okay, so it also controls various autonomic nervous system functions, including respiration, digestion, heart rate, functions related to your blood vessels, swallowing, and believe it or not, sneezing. The cerebrum is made up of 5 lobes. 4 of them are visible in this model. The frontal lobes, which you can see approximately here, are involved in planning and executing movement. They're involved in complex mental functions like behavior, conscience, and personality as well. Posterior to that, we have the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes, which are approximately here, are involved in processing and integrating sensory information. They also function in our ability to maintain attention. Posterior to the parietal lobes are the occipital lobes, which are approximately here. The occipital lobes function in vision processing. Finally, we have the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes are approximately here. The temporal lobes are involved in hearing, language, memory, and emotion. As I mentioned previously, the cerebrum is divided into left and right hemispheres, and the hemispheres are separated by a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. In this anterior view of the brain, we can see the longitudinal fissure highlighted in yellow right here. So you can see it basically splits the brain right in half along the sagittal plane. Another important landmark on this model is the central sulcus, which is highlighted by this green line right here. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, but more importantly, it's the landmark that shows us where the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus are located. The precentral gyrus, which is highlighted in red here, it's this red band that goes across both hemispheres. The precentral gyrus is where we're going to find the primary motor cortex. Many of the neurons that initiate movement of our body parts are located in this raised area of the brain. The postcentral gyrus is back here. It's this purple band, just posterior to the central sulcus. So you can see it here. Probably shouldn't have used green for that, but I hope you can see this. It goes across both hemispheres. The postcentral gyrus is the seat of the primary somatosensory cortex. This is the main area for the somatosensory reception ability of the body. So this means that sensory information about touch, pressure, temperature, and pain that's coming from the skin, muscles, joints, and other body parts comes here. In this model, we can better see some of the areas of the brain. I'm going to do this the best that I can without wasting your time, but this whole area is the cerebrum. We're just looking at it as if we were to remove one of the hemispheres. So we're looking at the deepest surface here. Not the exterior, but the interior. Okay, so this is the cerebrum. You'll probably recognize it because of the gyri. Remember, gyri are the bumps that we see at the surface of the brain. And sulci. Remember, sulci are the grooves that we see in the surface of the brain. So that's the cerebrum. The most superficial portion of this structure is a layer of gray matter that's only a few millimeters thick, and it's called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is a major location for integration in the brain. Here, sorry, not down there, here is the pons. Okay, the pons. And the pons is basically like a relay station that relays information out to the cerebellum and back to the brain and spinal cord. This down here that I started highlighting before, this is the medulla oblongata. It's an extension of the brain stem that's going to be continuous with the spinal cord. So it's going to help transmit information from the spinal cord up to the brain and from the brain down to the spinal cord. Now let's look at a few other structures. I'm going to get rid of these lines here. They're kind of distracting. The first structure that you need to know is the diencephalon. The diencephalon is deep within the cerebrum, and I'm going to highlight it in red here. Okay, this is the diencephalon, and there are 4 parts to the diencephalon. You're responsible for knowing 2 of them. The 2 that you need to know are the thalamus. So the thalamus is in this region here. The thalamus is basically a relay station that basically determines what signals from the inferior portions of the brain and cerebellum actually go up here to the cerebral cortex, and what information from the cerebral cortex actually gets all the way down to the spinal cord. You might think of it as being like a filtering station as well as a relay. In addition to the thalamus, you need to know the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is this area right here. It's roughly triangle shaped. To me, it looks a little bit like a funnel. Okay, but it's this area right in here. And the hypothalamus is important because it regulates some of your homeostatic processes in the body. It secretes hormones and it controls your body temperature, your sense of hunger, thirst, fatigue. It also is involved in regulating sleep and circadian cycles. Inferior to the hypothalamus is a pea-shaped or pea-sized gland. It would be right out here, called the pituitary gland. Now, on a lot of our models, the pituitary gland is actually missing, but some of our models do have it. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus via a little stalk called the infundibulum, which you can kind of see. I tried to draw it here. Let me do it in purple so you can see it better. So it would be right here. The pituitary gland is also called the master gland because it secretes hormones that regulate major functions in the body, such as thyroid activity, sexual maturation. It secretes hormones that help your bones and muscles grow, secretes hormones that regulate kidney activity and thus influence blood pressure. It does a lot of things. It's not the only gland in the brain, though. This back here is the pineal gland. Okay, the pineal gland secretes a serotonin-derived hormone called melatonin, and melatonin is involved in modulating our sleep patterns, and it also influences your circadian cycles. So this is why when people have difficulty sleeping, sometimes they'll take melatonin supplements. They're hoping to increase the amount of hormone in their bodies, and they hope that it will help them get to sleep a little bit better. The corpus callosum, which I'm going to highlight in green here, is a disc, kind of like a disc-shaped structure, superior to the thalamus and hypothalamus. It's superior to the diencephalon. It's this area right here. So this is a band of white matter that connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain, and it allows electrical impulses from the right hemisphere to go to the left side of the brain, and it allows impulses from the left side of the brain to go to the right side of the brain. So it facilitates communication. The last structure that we need to focus on this slide is this kind of fern-shaped structure here at the cerebellum. This is called the arbor vitae. Arbor means tree, right? And vitae means life, so this is the tree of life. And I'm not going to highlight all of it because I don't want to waste your time, but it's this white kind of branched structure here associated with this cerebellum. So the arbor vitae brings sensory information and motor information to the cerebellum, and it also dispatches information from the cerebellum to the rest of the brain. The ventricles are four cavities deep within the brain that contain cerebral spinal fluid. Without these cavities, the brain would basically collapse upon itself from its sheer weight. The cerebral spinal fluid in these spaces also serves a protective function. It helps prevent it helps prevent injury when the brain is jostled or the head is hit. So if we were to take the cerebral spinal fluid out of the brain and fill it with plastic instead, we would get a model that looks like this. There are two lateral ventricles. You can see one of them here. There's one on the other side as well. So there's one lateral ventricle for the left hemisphere and one for the right. You can kind of see where they fit here within the brain. Okay. You can think of these as being kind of like ventricles number 1 and 2. So there are two lateral ventricles, one in the left hemisphere, one in the right. The third ventricle, which is located here, you can kind of see it. Okay, so the third ventricle is located around the thalamus. And then there's a fourth ventricle that's located right here. You can kind of see that here on this model. Okay. The third ventricle around the thalamus and the fourth ventricle down here near the cerebellum are connected by a passageway that you can see right here. This is the cerebral aqueduct. So those are the structures that you need to know for the brain. I hope this was helpful. I would definitely take some time to look at these structures using Visual Body as well as your lab book and make sure that you know them so that you can do well for your quizzes and your practicals.